ברוכים הבאים. אני מאוד מאוד שמח. I'm very, very happy and pleased to have with us Professor Michael Stein from Harvard Law School Project on Disability, and a long-time colleague, friend, and supporter of many of us here and at home. Thank you, Michael, for taking the time in this very busy schedule you have to talk to us. And we challenged Michael So we challenged Michael with something that we thought might be of interest. So this year, we put some focus on matters of aging. And so basically the question we posed to Michael and wanted to have his input on that was, in what way maybe the lessons learned from the Convention on the Rights of Persons with Disabilities could be of relevance to the discussions that are held and are probably lively and interesting about having maybe similar treaty on the rights of people in old age. And is it even okay to do the comparison just as a human rights matter, or maybe there are other things that are parallel in some way? And so that's what we're going to hear about in the next 30 minutes. Then we asked our dear friend and colleague, Professor Isi Doron, to respond or add his comments and thoughts on the matter from his perspective, as this is his field of expertise. And then we open it up for discussion. You're very welcome to open your cameras because we see you all. You don't have to, though. You're not on the screen, but Michael could see you and see how you respond to his thoughts and so on. So I think it'll be more personable and feel more like a kind of a meeting between, like a regular meeting, as if you were here. Okay, I leave the floor to you, Michael.
Thank you, Oren, and it's always a pleasure to be back. It's 4 years since I was in Israel, so I'm especially happy to be here. And I even have a little note, which I don't usually use because I'm a bit wobbly. And thank you, Izzy, for making time. We last saw each other at the World Conference, and I'm looking forward to your interventions and thoughts and to learning from them. So the reason that we thought this might be a fun topic, including that it's part of the larger endeavor of the center over the past year, is that having been involved in drafting the Convention on the Rights of Persons with Disabilities, the CRPD, I'm now been asked to participate in the drafting of the Treaty on the Rights of Older Persons. And I am reflecting a lot personally on what we can learn and what we need to learn, and where there are issues that I'm really not sure which way we're going. Hopefully Izzy can answer all of that for me in his 15 minutes, and that would be very appreciated. And I know that his heart is in working on these issues as well, so I'm very curious and eager to hear his thoughts. So there are some things that we think about. The CRPD, as we call it, was adopted by consensus in December of 2006. We are in the second decade now of work leading up to a treaty on the rights of older persons. So the timetables are very different. The CRPD was drafted in 5 years, quickest drafted human rights treaty in UN history. The Older Persons Treaty is still developing and very slowly. The Latin American countries have been extraordinarily supportive for a number of years, which is the reason why the Organization of American States in 2015 passed their own regionally based treaty for older persons, much like the Organization of American States passed the Inter-American Convention on the Rights of People with Disabilities well before the CRPD. They've been very progressive and thoughtful about this. And it's been there for quite a while, but now we're getting some pressure to see progress on it. And it's pushed by, to me anyway, two different forces. One is demographics, and the other is kind of trauma post-COVID. So the demographics, depending upon which statistics you believe and where you look, because statistics are used differently in different places, the world is clearly getting older. And some of the statistics that are thrown out are that by the year 2030, the number of people over 60 will outnumber the number of people who are youth, meaning 30 and under, and be roughly double the number of children, meaning 18 and under. Other fun numbers that are thrown out from time to time are that by 2040 or so, the majority of children on the planet will be on the continent of Africa. So all these fun demographics are pushed out as a way of trying to show the imminency now of doing it. And in the real world, because people respond to stimuli rather than to facts, as in why we're now maybe kind of sort of thinking about climate change as the earth burns. But for the last 20 years, despite having data, we haven't done very much about it. Are lessons from COVID. So, just first of all, the data on COVID is highly incomplete in the US and around the world. We didn't bother disaggregating very well on disability or on age. In India, they just simply filed the death certificates and marked them natural causes and then took the bodies to the crematoria. But we know that in the US, for example, the death rate among older persons was in institutional care and otherwise was roughly 5 times that of the general population, meaning the non-older population, much like the death rate among people with disabilities in institutional care was 3 times that of the general population. And COVID was never the great leveler. That was a very silly phrase that came out of it, but what it was a microscope on many of the social inequities. And whether it's the number of people who died, or whether it was, our wonderful past president saying that COVID was not an issue and not a danger, it would simply affect those who are old or frail, as if that's a valid excuse for mortalities. In both cases of the CRPD or of an older person's treaty, we have a demographic overlap that's quite significant. If you are lucky enough to live long enough, you will have a disability. If you get anywhere near your projected statistical life year, you will have a disability, whether it's a small prosthesis like this, or whether it's a more significant prosthesis like the one I'm sitting on, assistive technology, you will have it. So there is an overlap of population within the two groups, and therefore there has been some questions about, why do we really need a special treaty for older persons when we have a treaty for people with disabilities? It's an interesting question because in the 5 years of negotiating the CRPD, the groups representing older persons were nowhere to be seen. They wanted no part of it. They were not connected to it politically. The American Association of Retired Persons, which is for 40 and over because the Age Discrimination and Employment Act is 40 and over, is probably the largest and most powerful and well-funded lobbying group in the US, and they refuse absolutely to interact with the disability community, despite very clear areas of common interest. From a political science point of view, that's pretty horrific, but it is the way it is. So there is a significant overlap. There are other lessons that are similar as well. The question of why we needed a disability treaty was raised in the beginning, certainly in the first of the 8 ad hoc sessions. At the disability treaty, it was only the United States that said we don't need a disability-specific treaty. Again, American exceptionalism. Every other country in the world thought that we did need one. But the question is raised again here for why elders if we have all these other treaties? Well, some of the lessons that we've learned from the CRPD is that when you shine a focus on a group that's been excluded, you have attention given to the group. Or if you want to be economic goal. If you're not counted, you don't count. And if you have mandates that require your inclusion, then at least on a technical and superficial level, and often on a real level, you will be included. So for the CRPD, if you look at the treaty bodies, the groups that monitor all those other universal human rights treaties, you would see, and this was a study by Leandra Despoy, a special rapporteur from Argentina, that there were no cases related to disability at the treaty body level. I exaggerate a little, there were 17 brought in a decade, and 13 of them were declared inadmissible. So children with disabilities, women with disabilities, people of color with disabilities, immigrants with disabilities, disability is absent. We also know during that time that the MDGs, Millennium Development Goals, which was the largest development initiative globally, did not include disability. The word does not appear in the 9 goals or the 21 targets or the 60 indicators, just absent. Doesn't exist, never saw them before. Didn't know that had anything to do with it. And so at that time, we said that people with disabilities were 10% of the global population, but 20% living below the poverty line, and the MDGs were intended to eradicate poverty. But the D word didn't appear. I'll pause for a minute and say that one of the benefits of having a CRPD is that the D word now does appear. So after the CRPD's enactment, largely because of, one, the UN has bound itself to implementing the treaty, and 2, there have been efforts to expand the scope of what international law and international humanitarian law do in reference to disability because of Article 11. We've seen this monumental growth of disability included in programming. So whether it's the Sustainable Development Goals, SDGs, that follow the MDGs and the 17 references to disability, including education in Goal 4, or whether it's the UN Program on the Rights of People with Disabilities, which is the Secretary General's program to educate across the UN system. I'm doing their initial lecture on Tuesday after I get home. Whether it's every agency in the UN, whether it's UNICEF or DESA or SCAP, now has a disability focal person point, and they all report to each other in an interagency way. So disability is across all of the UN programming now. It never was before. Or whether it's the big elephant in the room, which is the World Bank, which forever swore it had nothing to do with human rights and was sanctioned by the generals. You know, when the General Assembly sanctioned South Africa for apartheid, the World Bank said, well, we're just a bank. Sorry, just a bank. We just keep loaning money. We're just a bank. And then they figured out through Nino de Nino, who was the general counsel, that actually they are part of the UN system. They're a specialized agency and they're required to abide by the United Nations treaties and edicts, and start to include other populations, and now have disability as part of their environmental safeguard factors, which means that any loan of those $180 billion a year that go through the World Bank has to be assessed for how it impacts on disability. So this has been a truly effective and game changer. Having said that, of course, there are lots of areas and room for improvement. In the same way that the CRPD looked at ableism, a older persons treaty will look at ageism, stigma based upon age. And the pushback against an older persons treaty that in high income countries, older persons accumulate wealth over time and therefore are in better financial condition than others, is not really persuasive when you consider where older persons are in the 80% of the world that's low and middle income. It also doesn't answer the question of stigma, which in parallel, when my very, very good looking, very, very wealthy African-American classmate who grew up in Beverly Hills gets called the N-word, his wealth and his social status doesn't really prevent that. So stigma still exists. And again, we go back to COVID. But what I'd like to do is raise questions that I'm not sure exactly what the answers are. And I'm supposed to be figuring this out along with the working group on aging. The working group's been extended until next April. And therefore, if there's going to be a resolution at the General Assembly, it will not be until September of 2024. But we need to do a few things until then, including draft the actual treaty. So besides a general human rights treaty that covers things like, employment, education, remember lifelong education is important too. Besides ones that cover things like that, there are a couple of questions that I'm wondering about. One is areas of definition. So the CRPD does not actually define disability. It does have a range for it in Article 1, which is called purpose. It's the only article in any human rights treaty that's called purpose. And the reason it's called purpose is you're not allowed to reserve, I'll take it except for this part, against the purpose of a treaty. We could not get to a univocal definition of disability. And as we look across the globe, we see that definitions are extremely different from nation to nation. There is now, for the very first time, a trickle of truly comparative data that does apples to apples and oranges to oranges on prevalence rates. That's coming out of Sophie Mitra's Disability Data Initiative at Fordham. I was with her, I think, last week or 2 weeks ago. But the definition is subject to national interpretation. It's something that people from the disability rights movement don't like, because on the one hand, we claim that disability is a social construction. And if it's a social construction, then it's a social construction. And there should be what the Europeans refer to as a margin of appreciation, a little give room on how we define it. So what do we do about aging? There are different definitions in different parts of the world. People are also living much longer. And in many cases, depending upon where they are, much healthier. So one question is, do you need a set definition for it, or should this again be kind of a range and let countries decide how to apportion it? Underneath the definition and not articulated is the idea that the larger the group that's entitled to various protections, the more costly and extensive the benefits that a state has to pay. And so unsaid, but often driving some of these definitions are, how broad does the country want the group to go? Another major issue has to do with legal capacity. In the CRPD, Article 12 was one that was pushed very strongly by the International Disability Caucus, and specifically by users and survivors of psychiatry. It was a response to guardianship and to not having decision-making. It was a response to involuntary treatment for mental illness. And in drafting the Article 12, and then in influencing the CRPD committee, the group that's monitoring the convention, to issue a general comment and interpretive guideline on what it means, they came out with what is called an absolutist or a fundamentalist, I call a fundamentalist position, which is everyone, always, given sufficient support, can make decisions for themselves. To me, this is clearly wrong. It is 98% right, but it's also wrong. People in comas do not announce their desire on what to eat or what stock to invest in. People with 15 IQs, many of whom I work with and value, will be able to decide, if you put in front of them choices of food, what it is they want to eat. They know if you like them or not. They very clearly know if you like them or not. But again, they're not going to be deciding other things. So it's a myth. It's a lovely myth. It's an aspirational one. And most of the guidance from the CRPD committee is actually not guidance. It's more rhetoric and sometimes polemic. So what do you do with people? And most of it is focused on, again, psychosocial disability. What do you do with people who do not have advanced health directives, who show up without a supported decision maker, which is supposed to solve all this, at the emergency room? and cannot articulate to the clinician what they want or don't want. What do you do if someone shows up with an advanced health directive that says, never, ever, ever put me in the psychiatric hospital, and the clinician explains to them what's going on, and they say, yes, please put me in the psychiatric hospital. I need help. What do you do with someone who is under guardianship, say a child, who says, I need mental health access, and the parents, because of stigma and reputation, say, no, we can't have our son, daughter, whatever, being in this institution. And so of the work that's been done, it's focused on this regime, and I'm guilty in part on this. I have a book with Vikram Patel. It's on mental health, legal capacity, and human rights. 1/3 of it is written by people with lived experience, 1/3 by clinicians, and 1/3 by human rights lawyers. So we thought we were trying to help move the dialogue forward. But what about all the other groups that deal with legal capacity? Is having dementia, if we're jumping over to the older persons treaty, the same as having schizophrenia in terms of entering into or entering out of decisional ability? Or is it more like a cognitive disability? How do we deal with this? We can learn some lessons, but obviously we need to tailor more. And we don't know enough from the disability realm not to make mistakes in the older person's realm. But of course, mistakes are in part how we learn, but then we also regret it because people get hurt by mistakes. Independent living in the CRPD came out of the idea that people with disabilities have been segregated and put into congregate care and institutions, not given voice, treated in conditions that approximate what the UN refers to as inhuman and degrading conditions. What does independent living mean for older persons? The independent living movement, as it's articulated from Berkeley and then later from Sweden by Adolf Ratzka, is the idea that people in high income countries pool their monthly disability benefits and live together in some kind of communal scheme, whereby they share things like care attendance, foods, transportations, etc. There are interesting parallels now rising up in different parts of the world. For example, single mothers pooling their resources and living together. But I'm unaware of anything like that. Maybe Izzy knows, I'd love to hear it, in the old person's area. Instead, people either live at home if they have high resources, with support or without that much support, live with families and age that way. If they have lots of income, they live in, here at least in the Western world, in assisted living, where medical help is not provided, but supervision and support is provided. And otherwise, they live in nursing homes, right? Gila Zahav and others, where medical care is provided. And as we saw in COVID, these were pretty much death traps. People just simply died over and over. What about the idea of a deinstitutionalization movement on behalf of older persons? I haven't heard of it. One of these days, I will be an elder person, I hope. And I certainly do not want to live in a nursing home. So what happened to that? There is no deinstitutionalization movement. There is no, so far as I know, equivalent of group homes whereby states provide funding to a group of older persons to live together with some support in the community. Right? It would make sense from an economic perspective. Allegedly, at least as late as the 80s, when they used to keep track of this, it's cheaper to live in the community than it is in these large-scale warehouses, unless, of course, you're Serbia or Romania or Georgia, in which case it's much cheaper to live in large congregate care because of the way that they treat these people. So what is independent living going to mean? And by the way, does independent living also mean supporting older persons who lose their partner? So probably everyone who knows a couple that's been together and one of them passes away and the remaining spouse, partner, whatever, has no idea of how to write a check, if checks still exist. right? Or how to do other things. So what does independent living mean? Related to that, the use of information communication technology and the impact of artificial intelligence. The CRPD was the first treaty that came out after the digital revolution, evolution, whatever it is that you'd like to call it. It has some interesting parts of it that reflect it. There is the waiver of intellectual property when it prevents access to information on an equal basis with others. That in turn led to the Marrakesh Treaty for the blind, the visually impaired, etc. There is the encouragement of the sharing of technologies and technology transfers. It's usually phrased in terms of north to south, but John Lazar and I had a book on information technology and the global south because there are lots of really cool and way more economically efficient practices that come from the global south because they frankly can't waste the money on doing things. What does it mean for the older generation that cannot use ICT and is increasingly and rapidly being forced into that situation? Currently, I'm not yet an older person. Nearly everything related to our kids' schools are on apps. And whether we like it or not, you need to have the app to do it. Or more graphically, during COVID, we were told in Massachusetts, don't worry, just log on to your computer, go to the website, put in the information, and you'll be automatically scheduled, which was rubbish because, first of all, they designed it really poorly, which comes when you have a governor who led a healthcare company. Thankfully, he's not there anymore. But what happens if you're not used to these things? How do you navigate the world when you're expected to use devices you didn't use and weren't trained for? What is AI going to do or not do for persons who are older? And by the way, for persons with disabilities? Will it be an effective assistive device? Remind you to take your medicine? Remind you to walk your dog? Maybe be the notepad that people with dementia are told to stick into their pockets? You know, you'll have something in your ear that buzzes and tells you where you have to be and reminds you who you are. Or is it going to be something that will systemically remove people with older status or with disabilities from participating in society? If you can't keep up, you're out. What do we do about the standard of living? We mentioned some of the demographics. Well, when the majority of the globe is over 60, who's going to support them? To put it in smaller bites, post-World War II in the US, there were 6 working people for every 1 person receiving social benefits. Right now, we're down to 2.5 to 1. Japan is under 1, and the EU is hovering at 2. So who's going to pay for this population? And what kind of standard of living will they have? For the generation that's going to be creeping into retirement within the next decade, many of them lost their pensions in the 2008 crash. So who supports them and what do they do? And this also means food security or food insecurity, access to health, etc. Some questions that are more vague and fuzzy, and again, I don't have the answer to it, and that is, what do we do about social inclusion? In the disability realm, we talk about being able to participate just like everybody else, or what the disability studies scholar Jacobus Tenbrook referred to as the right to live in the world. Older persons have this right too. They want to have this right. What do we do about loneliness? The United Kingdom actually has a minister assigned to loneliness. What do we do about loneliness? If we're being really hardcore economists, we would look at loneliness and its effect on health. It's dramatically hard on health. The WHO has an entire program on social inclusion and loneliness, and basically what it says is, connect with other people. Don't be alone. Go to the library, go to a dance, that sort of thing. But what do you do if you're a state? And what can you actually create a right for social inclusion? And what on earth would it mean? I'm not sure. A question asked to me by a very brilliant anthropologist, Arthur Kleinman, is there some kind of a right to feel valued? He's an anthropologist and a psychiatrist and a very wise man, and is now in his 80s, and he looks at his peers who have retired, and he wonders, what do you do? What can you do about this group who feel like they have given over decades or their lives to their communities, their families, and now they're by themselves? Do we do something? How can we do something to make them feel that their contributions were valued, that they're still welcome? Along the same lines, much as we've had lots of pushes towards retirement of people in the older categories, are we actually calculating the costs and benefits of institutional memory, knowing how to do things, not reinventing the wheel, having networks when employers, states, and others consider how much people cost? So I don't know the answer to these things. Some of them we're going to have to figure out. And there are a lot of other ones to try to figure out. But I thought I'd throw that out there and now let Izzy answer all the questions.
As thank you very much, Michael. You stole my joke. I was just about to say, well, thought-provoking lecture. Now let's hear all the answers from Professor Doron. So thank you, Michael. It's been many questions. Let's see what we get to. Professor Isi Doron, the dean of, I don't remember the exact name of the faculty, but social welfare and medical sciences and health sciences. And the expert, if I may say, on aging rights in Israel. Thank you so much for agreeing to the challenge of discussing and responding, and the floor is yours.
אהלן, דבר ראשון, רק תגיד לי ששומעים אותי כמו שצריך.
כן.
אוקיי. So, I'll start in Hebrew. אהלן לכולם, נעים מאוד, שמח להיות פה, שמח לראות בקהל אנשים שאני מכיר היטב, בטח יותר חכמים ממני. אז תודה על ההזדמנות להגיב, ותודה על ההזדמנות להשתתף באירוע החשוב הזה. Hi Michael, it's Isi. Thank you, Professor Michael Stein, for your great presentation so far. It's a great opportunity to meet you again. And once again, I would like to thank you both for participating and for allowing me to respond to your wise words. It's also a good opportunity to thank Oren. Oren, thank you very much also for inviting me and thinking of me. I will try to do my best in this short time. The framework of this presentation and this lecture, from at least my understanding, was is there an historical way that the human rights of older persons movement can learn from the experience of the persons with disabilities human rights experience, especially in light of the reality that the persons with disabilities rights movements were successful in establishing their own unique human rights convention, the CRPD, which has been, I'm no expert, but I would allow myself to say it's considered to be a huge success from an historical perspective in succeeding to create in most part of the world a paradigm shift, so to speak, in the way human rights of older persons are constructed and viewed, and to actually make also a significant change, again, generally speaking, in the lives of persons with disabilities across the globe. So taking this starting point as a reference and comparing the CRPD and the human rights of persons with disabilities to my, so to speak, social movement, which is the human rights of older persons movement, which so far has failed in its international quest to establish a new and unique and specific international human rights convention for older persons. Certainly the question begs is why? Why is there such a difference, and why have we, the older persons, failed while the persons with disability have succeeded? So, relating to this question, let me first admit or put on the table that there is always a fascinating historical and philosophical question. Can we learn anything from history? So there is a philosophical question. Is the historical struggle of the persons with disability human rights movement can serve any lesson to the older persons movement, in the sense that history never repeats itself? Again, others may argue differently, and it's always history is always the outcome of very, very specific local contextual circumstances. So this is a very big philosophical question, and one can say that it's really irrelevant what happened to the persons with disabilities, and every unique population which has its own human rights convention. So I don't know, women, children, once you learn its history and why historically do we have CEDA, the Human Rights Convention for Women, it's always an outcome of very, very contextual and specific historical circumstances, which eventually you cannot really learn anything from it if you want to move to another population in a different time and space. However, I must admit that as an older person's human rights activist, I'm very jealous of the persons with disability human rights movements, as we are still struggling and are still unsuccessful in shifting at the UN level, I'm talking, and shifting the global political attitude toward the realization and willingness to move forward and establish a new and unique human rights convention for the rights of older persons. So having said that, let me give you some context, the unique context and the different context of the history of the human rights of older persons. One needs to remember that historically, and that is very similar to persons with disability, older persons were invisible in the traditional historical human rights convention of the 1950s and 1960s, and even in the 1970s, okay? Nothing, almost nothing about older persons. And again, this was similar, I think, to persons with disabilities. No mention, no specific reference, no acknowledgement, no understanding, no visibility. And in essence, older persons were totally invisible in the landscape of the international human rights sphere, so to speak. However, and this is, again, historically very interesting, since 1982, in what is known as the Vienna International Plan of Action on Aging, which was the outcome of the first global meeting on aging, the field of aging in the context of soft law really proliferated. So we had the VIPA, we had the various international documents and many, many policy papers peaking at the 2002 MIPA, which was the continuation of VIPA, which is the Madrid International Plan of Action on Aging, which is still active in force, and etc. We had a lot of soft law policy documents and many, many millions of letters written about the need to address the interests of older persons and the realization of the aging demographics of the world and the aging revolution, etc. So actually speaking, on the international level, older person and the phenomena of the aging revolution had a lot of attention at the UN level. However, and this is a big however, all the discourse was a social policy problem or a social policy context with very little reference to human rights discourse. And none of these many, many documents that I've mentioned had any legally binding force. So in real life and in real life experience, all of these different and very rich literature, so to speak, made very little change or difference in the rights of, in the lives of older persons in reality. So it was only in 2009, which I had the honor to be part of, within the context of a UN expert meeting in Bonn, which specifically looked into the issues of human rights of older persons, that the first formal recommendation was to start to think and reframe the issues of older populations within the UN context from a policy paradigm to a human rights paradigm. And since 2009, we actually have seen, as an outcome of this UN expert meeting recommendation, a very significant change and some very significant advancements. So, for example, we do have on the regional level at least one binding human rights convention on specifically on the rights of older persons in the Inter-Americas. We do have still a non-binding, but which was officially adopted, the additional protocol to the African Union Charter. Within the European context, we do have the European Social Charter. And we do have a specific independent expert under the Office of the UN Commissioner of Human Rights since 2013, I think, or 2012. And most importantly, as Michael mentioned, since the decision in 2010, we have what is known as the UN Open-Ended Working Group on the Rights of Older Persons, which meets annually since 2011. And only about a month ago, or less than a month ago, during the Passover holiday here in Israel, we had yet another open-ended working group meeting in UN. So on the one hand, we can certainly show a big advancement and big progress, so to speak, in the last 15 years from a human rights approach within the context of rights of older persons. However, the big disappointment and the big challenge is that despite almost 14 years of operation of the open-ended working group and a lot of these advancements, there is still a big failure of the human rights of older persons movement to reach the achievement that persons of disabilities have achieved, which is the similar convention to as CRPD within the context of the human rights of older persons. So now to the point, can we learn anything from, can we, and I apologize, when we say we, I'm talking about the persons in the field of the human rights movements of older persons, can EC, in a metaphoric way, learn from Michael? And Michael taking as a representative, so to speak, of the persons with disability movement. As Michael mentioned, undoubtedly, there are some overlaps. Both populations are stigmatized, both populations are discriminated against, both are subject to mostly negative social construction, and both have experienced historical invisibility within the human rights movement. From a legal perspective, both populations also needed to battle against similar oppressive legal institutions. I think the most well-known and most trivial example is the legal institution of guardianship. Both older persons and persons with disabilities experienced throughout history the loss of fundamental human rights within the paternalistic regime of what we know as traditional guardianship. I must also share with you that in the last, at least my personal experience, in the last at least 10 years, there have been many meetings in various levels that people from the older persons human rights movement have met with persons with disability movements in order to learn from the latter experience. I had personally many meetings, and in this context, I cannot not mention my dear colleague, Professor Gerald Quinn, who many of you may know, who was very influential and heavily involved in the establishment of the CRPD, and was recruited and is now part of our movement, so to speak. And I personally, but I know many other people have spent many, many hours with Gerard in order to learn from the experience of the development and enactment of the CRPD in order to use this precious experience in order to move forward in the context of a new convention for older persons. However, I must also emphasize, and again, as someone who's not only a legal scholar, but an activist, that, and I think Michael will agree with me, that older persons are not persons with disability. Ageism is not ableism. And while, as Michael mentioned, there are some overlaps within the two groups, these are very, very different and distinct social groups. And many times the initial reaction is, whenever we bring together these two populations, is, at least from our, again, older person's perspective, is to begin the conversation is, with all due respect, CRPD, it's not that it's irrelevant, but it's a convention which is not a human rights convention for older persons. So this initial point is very, very important to distinguish. Moreover, and this has to be said, throughout the years, we have recognized that there are tensions, key tensions between the CRPD and the potential human rights vision of persons, of older persons. I will give you just two examples, but I think there are more. The first example is Michael mentioned, is the issue of nursing homes and residential care. As Michael mentioned, at least some would argue that under CRPD, any residential care, and obviously every nursing home, is by definition an infringement of human rights. From a human rights perspective, persons with disability need to be within the community, and it's the duty of the state to provide appropriate services that will accomplish the basic and fundamental human right of persons with disabilities to live in and within the communities. However, within the older persons human rights movement, this is not so clear, and this is not so obvious. And there is recognition that for some older persons and within some social context, residential care settings are not only not an infringement of human rights, but actually a valid and appropriate policy solutions to interest of older persons within unique context, especially if that's their will and desire. So you can see potentially some gaps or tensions between the ideological or human rights definitions of nursing homes and residential care solutions within the older person's perspective, as opposed to a CRPD perspective. So that's one example. Another well-known example is in the field of a substitute decision, as opposed to a supported decision-making. Again, from the CRPD, and or in generally speaking, and Michael can correct me on this, the general ideological approach is that from a CRPD perspective, or from a human rights of persons with disability, substitute decision-making is unacceptable. It takes away the basic fundamental human rights of the person with disability to make decisions. Once again, from an older person's human rights perspective, legal documents such as the advanced directives or nominating in advance a substitute decision maker is actually quite legitimate and actually a very appropriate legal alternative to traditional guardianship. So if I today, while fully capable, nominate my wife to be my substitute decision maker and enable her basically to make any legal decision on how she believes is best for me, but this is my decision. From an older human rights perspectives approach, this is totally valid and even appropriate. This is not the case, I believe, from a CRPD perspective, and again, Michael can correct me, but certainly there are some gaps. So one can realize that there are some differences of understandings of the fundamental constructions of the meaning of human rights, or potentially some gaps between the CRPD and the way a future convention for the rights of older persons will be shaped. Again, which raises or used to raise some concerns to the the amount of support that a new convention of rights of older persons will receive from the Persons with Disability human rights movement, and again, which is an interesting topic. So reaching to the last aspect that I wanted to share, but so why are we not successful as opposed to the success of persons with disabilities? And again, I will share some insights, which is based, I must admit, from many hours of talks with both Gerard and other people. And again, Michael, you can comment on that and share your perspective. First of all, many times I was told in my meetings at the UN, at the open-ended working group, about the power of the civil society or the significant visibility and activity of the civil society, NGOs, of the Persons with Disabilities human rights movement. This very famous slogan of nothing about us without us was very voiceful, very visible, and the role that civil society, NGOs played within the UN and the power that was sent from this very active participation, vocal participation, visible participation of the civil society, of the human rights of persons with disability movement was a very key force in the success of the CRPD. And one must admit, at least from my experience so far, at the UN level at least, there is still a lack of this power of civil society and NGO on the international level within the older persons human rights movement. And this is something that I will touch upon in my conclusion on the difference. A second point is ideology and what we know as politics of identity. I think that in the human rights movements of persons with disability, the politics of identity was very clear. People identified themselves and were very proud of identifying themselves as persons with disability. It was part of their human and personal and group identity, which was translated into a discourse of a politics of identity of persons with disabilities. Unfortunately, and while I hope it is changing, we still lack this similar powerful ideological politics of identity within the human rights movement of older persons. Still many, if not the majority of all those older persons, do not personally identify themselves politically as proud older people. As part of ageism, many times on the contrary, they don't want to identify themselves as older persons or try to do everything to stay young, so to speak. And this is very different from the persons with disability human rights movement, which was very, very powerful and grounded in this politics of identity. So for me, this is a second potential explanation. And lastly, again, it's pure luck and historical context. One needs to know, or at least from my experience, on the UN level, there is certainly, especially in Europe and the northern part of the world, there is something that one can characterize as human rights convention fatigue. There is a sense that there are already too many human rights conventions, and there are too many human rights instruments. We don't need more and more. We need to utilize and use the existing convention. We live also in a much more conservative and divisive international climate. What's happening in Ukraine, what's happening between Russia and the US, China and the US. The globe is very differently. Europe is very different. So we're in a different climate. We're a different time in history. And the willingness to move forward in new fronts of human rights in general and to establish yet a new international convention specific for older persons, I think we're in a different time in history, which again is very different. So what is my bottom line? The bottom line is, yes, certainly it is important to listen, to learn, to look into what have been the successes of the CRPD. again, the realization that we need to reframe our approach to human rights of all the persons, to emphasize its uniqueness, its unique paradigmatic shift that it will bring to the world as an outcome of this new convention, how it differs from both CEDA, CRPD, and any other existing human rights convention. And on the other hand, internally work hard to improve is not the appropriate word, but to strengthen the political power of the civil society, the political power of the politics of identity, and to strengthen the bottom-up approach to recruit local forces around the world within the politics of identity of all the persons, a distinct group, and maybe that will bring the change. So once again, thank you, Oren, for allowing me to comment. I hope I didn't talk too much. And Michael, thank you very much to your words and allowing me to comment on them. Thank you.
So I'll try, if you were to try to
And then open up.
recap this interesting thing. You know, the Talmud says about, there's a phrase in the book of Ecclesiastes, 2 turn into 3. It says, this is old age. When on 2 legs, you need to use a cane. So the traditional view is the same. I mean, yeah, this disabled person is the old person, maybe what we call today person with the abilities of premature aging. I mean, dementia, you mentioned, Krepline called it dementia precox. Schizophrenia was the earlier name. So, and I see this identity issue, maybe together it is one way of looking at it is to say, well, we don't care about the age, it's ageism. If somebody has some difficulty, whatever you call it technically, we have the CRPD, as you call it, and that's it. So one way is that old people rights merge with the persons with disabilities rights. Whether the disability has some difficulty, the cane you need, or that society creates your disability by discriminating on the basis of age. But then somebody would say, well, there's a fundamental difference here that you miss, because old people is a universal concept. We all will be or have been, while people with disability are a minority group. And old people have had the chance to develop fully as humans. They were given that chance. We may criticize why this chance is over now, but they have it. And the whole idea about the rights of people with disabilities is to allow certain people to have the chance to fulfill the maximum human potential at a critical, during their lives. And then you say, okay, if this is what you say about it, so maybe it's the other way around. Maybe when people with disabilities become old, they get defrocted from the disability status. I mean, you have had your share, and now you merge with old people group. And I sense in both talks this issue of feeling of identity threat here, where at certain circumstances, the old age might disappear and merge with the persons of disabilities, or in a certain other context, you would tell persons with disabilities, you are no more special people anymore, you are old like all other old people. So I will not develop further. I will open for discussion here, the interesting talk about the different directions of looking at these things. If there are any questions, can I see the Zoom questions here, or will we? Also, how does it work? You have, because
I don't know how it works. We're working on it. Okay, so basically, you can, if you want to say
does somebody want to
say or
comment, ask?
Yeah, and I'm a D. Gondina. I'm a postdoctoral fellow here at the law. And I just wanted to ask, Well, I actually had one comment and then I wanted to add another comment to what Lisa said. And I think just the notion that disability is a minority group, and distinct minority groups can also be contested. That disability is also a universal human condition. That the definition of disability also, like, disability lies on the spectrum, and also people become disabled. Like I said in the beginning, so I'm not 100% sure that, there's a very clear-cut distinction, even though I think it does work very well for political purposes. And which leads me to my other comment, which is, I think that one of the powerful notions in the disability rights movement is the social model of disability, the understanding that disability is something that is created by society and not by individual impairments. And I was wondering whether there is like a notion similar to that in the older persons movement, because I think that was a very, it was a significant animating force in creating this civil society, the disability politics, and even in terms of convincing policymakers to eventually adopt legislation and international convention. And thank you.
Just want to say one word. I think there is no other way but to see this as an issue of a minority group, even if arbitrarily defined. You go out, there are 2-3 slots in the parking for people with disabilities. It makes sense in 100-slot parking, but if you give 70 slots for people with disabilities, you miss the whole point. So it's a logical issue, and we hate exclusion in our discourse, but we need to create categories. And once there is such a category, and it's not a minority, I think the convention, the attitude, doesn't really make logical sense. Hopefully, it also will be minority want to be most of us healthy. More questions or comments, maybe.
Hello, and thank both the speakers for thought-provoking presentations. I wanted to point out one thing and then ask a question. Again, like Michael, no answer, just asking. The comment is that actually aging is a women's issue because women outlive men. And it's women who are left alone and don't know how to write the checks. They are I don't know what the numbers are, Issy knows those numbers, but aging is a women's issue. That's my first comment. My question is whether, my question is whether we ought to distinguish between living with disability and dying with disability. And I know this is a very sensitive topic, and I'm raising it because I'm preparing some end-of-life teaching for next year. And the thing is that aging is part of the process of dying, of departing from this world. And this does not discount any of the negative social exclusions that we all experience, including myself. I can say so personally. But when it comes to aging, this might be part of the politics of identity. I think that the aging comes with the fear of death and therefore with the denial. So I just wanted to bring that in. I think there was one study that I heard of a few years ago that actually statistically dying can last 2.5 years. And this is like medical dying. But in aging, we are experiencing a slow degeneration of the bodily functions, including the mental functions. And of course, dementia is also something that characterizes long age in our day and time. So I'm raising this question: should we be courageous enough to look at the difference between living with and dying with disability? Thank you for listening.
Oh, just two very astute comments, Carmel. Thank you. All I have to say is thank you, and certainly I need to reflect on that.
Thank you guys for speaking. My name is Stephanie. I'm a first-year medical student at the Sackler School of Medicine, the American program here. I'm passionate about this topic because I worked in a long-term care home for a year during COVID, so I was taking care of people in their last few years. And I just really felt like things needed to change. I felt like people spent the ends of their lives in very poor quality of life, and I just knew that things should be changed and can be changed. And you, Michael, talked about how there is very little being done to change this format of institutionalized homes. And I actually read a book recently by Atul Gawande, Being Mortal, which I'm sure many of you have heard of, but he gives a lot of examples of people who are trying to make movements. And I really just hope that that can become more widespread. I do have a question. I really liked what you said, Dr. Duran, about how there's a lot of pride associated with disabilities, but not necessarily with aging. I never thought of it that way. And I guess my question is, I feel like there's a lot that creates that stigma. So even like we just push old people into homes. It's almost like we don't want to see them. We just lock them away and don't want to deal with them. Even in culture, Carmel, like you mentioned, aging is a woman's issue. I think there's a lot more stigma when it comes to like women aging as opposed to men. And then small things too, like my mom complains about wrinkles and gray hair. Like she feels a lot of shame when it comes to her aging. So I was wondering if you guys think that this could just be an unanswerable question again. Can we actually instill pride in the elderly? I think there's some communities where there's a lot of pride in being old in terms of the wisdom and the experience that you have that young people don't. So it was a bit heartbreaking to hear that there is no pride in aging, but I think there should be. I think there's a lot, and I think we can all individually participate in that. So yeah.
Thank you. אתה יכול לדבר בלי המיקרופון, שאתה ליד זה אתה יכול לדבר.
אני פשוט לא, אני עוד רוצה להשתתף.
כן, אז אם יש אנשים שרוצים לדבר, אתם יכולים גם, תרגישו חופשיים, אנחנו לא המון אנשים, אם יש מישהו שרוצה לדבר, הוא יכול לעשות על מיוט, וזה יהיה מנומס.
Well, I say for a second a word, there's an issue of intersectionality here, because much, I think, of the stigma or shame or frail self-esteem of the elderly is about their disability, not for being old, but not being able to perform, whether as a young people or others. So these things are interact. You might say that strengthening the role or the status or the perception of people with disabilities overall will trickle up to the aged. So you might have some difficulties, but it's not a reason for self-stigmatizing or setting for being put aside. But we are a society of achievement and of competition. And there is something, it's very important, I have again, when you were young, you were, running ahead and you were the leader. Now it's your turn to be behind the younger. And this logic of the life cycle that in a society that is based on the concept of competition serves much better people with disabilities. So you said, we help you run ahead and achieve a lot. But it applies less to people with aging. You have burned your candles. It's lots of our metaphors, the way we see life and society. But I think it has much to do with the social status related to competition, achievement is related to competition. Not every achievement is about being first. is about an ordinal status. And we have to think what status we give on an ordinal level to be the first in class, or to be wise, or to be happy, or to create something. Doesn't mean that I'm first or second or third.
Thank you all for the questions and comments. I will try to refer very, very shortly and quickly. First, Adi Goldiner. Adi, to your point, I would just say that I think that from the late 1960s, especially from the famous book of Professor Robert Butler, I think there's a broad understanding, which, at least in the field of the human rights of older persons, that one, aging is a natural, objective, even measurable human biological process that we all share. It's universal. Everybody ages. Nobody disputes that. Eventually, all of us will die, at least under current biological knowledge. And nobody denies this fact. However, unlike aging, being old is totally the product of social construction. There is nothing natural, objective in the concept of being old. It's totally a human invention. And in that aspect, the understanding that being an elderly or being an old is totally an invention of humankind. We realize that it's the human rights of persons with disabilities and human rights of older persons is very similar in its core, because disability is also a social construction. And again, the whole notion of disability as a concept is an invention. Who is disabled? Why someone is titled as disabled? It's totally the human imagination. There's nothing objective or natural or neutral about it. And once you realize it, you understand that the same thing is true in being old. So in that sense, at least from my perspective, ageism and ableism have very similar grounds in their understanding or their mutual understanding that both of these concepts and both of these human rights movements go against these social constructions and try to break them down and emancipate both older people and people with disabilities from these oppressive social constructions. And in that sense, I think this is also the answer to Stephanie's questions. And Stephanie, I would like to have you more optimistic, because if we, at least that's belief, once we have people realize, especially older people, that they are old only because younger people, or Stephanie, like you, call them old or construct them as being old, is when older people will revolt or and make a revolution against it and goes against it in and under the understanding that, yes, you define us as old, but the way you define us being old is not what you define of being old. And if you characterize us as a different social group and discriminate us, then we will fight against it under this social construct that you have made for us. And within these social contracts, we will fight for our rights. And this is the only way we can change the reality, not by ignoring it or denying it, but to some extent, embracing the existing social construct and fighting against them under our own unique social identity and acknowledging the fact that we are part of a unique social group. Again, this is, one can criticize such an approach, but this has been very, this was the key for the success of any other social group, which moves to Carmel's point. Again, take women as a social construct or as a unique social group, which once again in current critical LGBTQ approach, one can certainly say that gender is also a social construct. But once again, the success of such a movement is also based on the feminist ideology of group identity, which was based on this gender and feminist understanding. However, and going back to Carmel's point, it is a fascinating point that, as you mentioned, Carmel, rightfully so, aging is mostly a gender issue in the sense that the life expectancy of women is longer, and the majority of older people are women. Nevertheless, if you look into CEDAW, the Convention of Elimination of All Discrimination Against Women, there is very little reference to older women. And it was only in 2010 that for the first time, under the General Recommendation number 27, that the Committee on the Rights of Women specifically referred to older women. So even within the feminist movement, similar to other movements, older women were invisible, despite the fact of their significant visibility within the rights of older persons. So feminism also historically was an ageist social movement. I'm saying it with all due respect, yes, and cautiously, but it's only in the last 10, 20 years that the feminist movements have embraced ageivism and anti-ageist approach as well. So certainly the issue of politics of identity in the age of intersectionality, so older people with disability, older women, older refugees, older people with other identities is very challenging. There's no doubt about it. And once again, it's becoming certainly a challenge to the movement of human rights of older persons. However, we do believe that within the new Convention of Rights of Older Persons, it will be able to address specifically the issues of intersectionality within the human rights of older persons. So, for example, older people who are disabled, for example, older women, for example, older prisoners, for example, older immigrants, etc. So there are many unique intersectional human rights issues within the older population, which do not eliminate the issue or the fact that older persons are a unique and distinct social group within and under the current social construction around the world. So thank you for your comments.
Yeah, I see your.
I think I just wanted to mention that both for people with disabilities and for older persons, that there's something within each group that's different between the seeking for rights and inclusion and between the expression of pride as far as group or individual identity. And in both of those populations, I think it's a challenge to move from the rights to be excluded to we're proud of our identity, and for being extraordinarily honest, it is a challenge and difficult to take pride even in the natural circumstances of aging or disability, because disability is part of human variation, when most people who have entered the world without being old or disabled find that aging and disablement is not particularly a happy occurrence. There are learning experiences, there's richness, but as far as the overjoyed that my body doesn't work, in both cases, or my mind's not working so well, that's a bit more of a leap. And I wonder where the civil society movements will coalesce around either. We do have extensive disability rights networks around the world, and I'm blessed to work with them. We don't have really that in the aging area, although there's a couple of significant groups. So it's interesting as to where we place our primary identity markers when we think about our multiple identities and which one we want to express when and where. And that's not so much an answer as much as maybe a musing.
Thank you very much for this rich discussion. It touches the fundamental issue of human rights, as it started as something universal that is common to all people, and about the other, thinking about the needy, about other people. And then came the slogan, "Don't talk about us, speak out us." So particular groups took center stage. You talk about disabled people, talk about disability, all people, but in a way it is a reversal from the idea of talking about others and emphasizing what is universal. And ideally, we have in the human rights discourse, for example, people with disability, that focus on people with other needs, not just in every group in such a way. And it's particularly relevant to the fate of old people, because still most people are not old, and certainly we are in a vicious cycle. Those who work, those who are invited to UN conferences are not old. And when you become old, you miss the opportunity to speak up for something. So this certainly must be resolved in a certain way, how we can keep the vision of thinking first about the other, but having everybody's voice heard and represented. Thank you very much.